67. How do you like my gift? Katie, Vanessa, listen to me. Listen to me. When the women saw James rushing over, they stopped arguing and turned to face him. Their murderous gazes reached straight into his soul. They were furious. James felt like jumping into the Hudson River and swimming to the Maldives alone. He was terrified. Beyond desperate, an idea flashed in his mind. He immediately dropped to the ground. His entire body began to convulse and he started foaming at the mouth. At this moment, pretending to be deathly ill seemed like his wisest choice. It was not the most courageous move for a martial arts grandmaster, but it was all he had. Katie and Vanessa looked on in shock as James drooled and twitched on the ground. Their first impulse was to let him die there like the dog that he was, but eventually they realized they had to intervene. They crouched next to him and began checking his vitals, airway, breathing, and circulation. Vanessa looked over at Katie. Did this ever happen when you two were at college together? Katie shook her head. Nope. Then she asked, didn't you say you went to his hometown and met his parents? Did they say anything about this condition? No, Vanessa replied. He was fine the whole trip. In fact, more than one person said he was always as healthy as a bull. James heard all of this from the ground. When he saw they were no longer quarreling and were instead concerned about him, he was relieved. Through a stroke of dumb luck, he had found a way to keep them from going at each other. What should we do now? Vanessa asked. Maybe we should call 911. Katie agreed and took out her phone. James knew that now was the time to end this farce. He stopped with the phony foaming, then pretended to struggle to open his eyes. Katie put down the phone and the two of them helped him up from the pier. James, are you okay? Vanessa asked. Do you need to go to the hospital? I'm fine, he croaked, as if it took great effort. No worries. It's an old problem. I'll just rest for a while. I don't need to go to the hospital. But these were not stupid women. He could see the suspicion in their eyes. He touched his chest and pretended to be in pain. He moaned. Now the women were convinced something was amiss. They looked at James coldly. Let's go, Vanessa said. We'll sort this out on the boat. James could have fainted in relief. He knew that the storm had temporarily passed. The three of them ascended the gangway and boarded the yacht together. They spent the next half hour stowing their gear and preparing to set off. Vanessa and Katie made sure their rooms were not adjoining and they did not speak to each other as they bustled around the vessel. Just as James was about to undo the stern rope from its cleat on the dock, he was startled by someone calling out from the parking area. Wait a moment. He turned in the direction of the voice. A familiar figure was approaching. His mouth dropped open. What is she doing here? He said. It was Krista Moser. James's first thought was that something must have happened to his parents. Then he saw that she was carrying a suitcase like she was going on vacation. By this point, Katie and Vanessa saw her too. They came down the gangway and followed James up the dock. He was thinking furiously, trying to determine how this was going to play out. Katie was only slightly less angry about this new development because she did not know Krista. Vanessa, who had always been hostile to the lovely Silverbell concierge, stared daggers at James. Her sharp eyes cut through his skin and tore at his guts. Katie was the first to speak. Who is she? Does she want to get on the boat too? Everyone stared at James, waiting for an answer. He thought he was going to puke. Don't look at me like that, he whined. He took a deep breath and continued. Katie, this is Krista Moser. She runs the desk at my building and handles personal matters for the owner. Then he looked at Krista and asked the million-dollar question. Krista, why are you here? She looked at him in confusion and responded with a question of her own. Sir, didn't Mr. Klein tell you? James had no idea what she was talking about. He didn't say anything to me, he said. Well, that's odd, she said. Mr. Klein arranged for me to join your cruise. He asked me to serve as your personal assistant. James could not believe what he was hearing. I never said I needed an assistant. Now his brain was a 3-alarm fire. Vanessa and Katie were already way more than he could handle. With gorgeous Krista thrown into the mix, No! James couldn't let this happen. Elliot was screwing with him. That was it. This was all some sort of twisted joke. Krista seemed to read his mind. "Sir, don't you remember?" she said. "During dinner at the Palm, didn't you ask if I could come work for you?" Miss Arison was right there. She heard it too. James felt like his head was going to explode. He was only joking that night. He didn't expect Elliot to take him seriously. He realized, too late obviously, that sometimes it wasn't wise to make random jokes. You never knew who would take them seriously. He felt a chill on his back. He knew that there were two sets of cold eyes boring into him. Katie finally turned to Vanessa and asked, "Is it true?" Vanessa didn't say anything. She just looked at Katie and nodded, indicating that it was indeed true. Krista maintained an even composure, but inside she was amused. This love triangle James had apparently made for himself was about to become a foursome. After all, she had her own thoughts about this trip. A man like James Tucker was a rare breed in a city full of swaggering jerks. He was successful, confident, handsome, the total package. She made her living working with wealthy men, but James was the first one she could ever imagine having a relationship with. But now was not the time to even hint at her agenda. To them, she was simply his personal assistant on this voyage, nothing more. She would take her time building a relationship with him. James felt trapped. He felt he had no other choice but to allow Krista to come aboard. He could only pray it wouldn't make an already complicated situation even more difficult to navigate. But he still searched for some other way to weasel out of it. He tried resorting to reason. "Krista," he said with an air of exasperated chumminess, "you can see my situation here. I don't want a personal assistant. Thank you, but please go back to the Lux Villa." Krista shrugged her shoulders. "That's not an option, unfortunately. Mr. Elliot has already hired someone to do my job in my absence. The contracts have been signed. There is no position for me at Silverbell." James just looked at her blankly. "You are my little apple. No matter how much I love you, I don't feel too much." James's phone suddenly rang in his pocket. He took it out and looked at the screen. It was Elliot Klein. He hit accept. "James," Elliot said gleefully, "how do you like my gift?" Episode 68. Welcome aboard. Now James understood. So the mysterious gift Elliot mentioned last night was allowing Krista to go on sabbatical to become his personal assistant. Instead of being delighted, James couldn't have been more annoyed. How was this a gift? He had to think. Elliot Klein was his colleague, even his friend after their epic drinking session at Lou Wailu. He couldn't reject his kindness outright, but he had to try to find an honorable escape. James laughed awkwardly and said, "Thank you, Elliot, but seriously, I can't accept." "What? You don't like her?" Elliot asked. "You don't think she'll be valuable? You realize how talented she is, right? She's a top Harvard grad. She speaks 4 languages fluently and can get by in 4 others. And she's more mechanically inclined than I'll ever dream of being. Believe me, this is a person you want while traveling around the world on a yacht." Before James could respond, Elliot hung up. That was it. Game over. He stared at the phone, feeling helpless. Elliot's words echoed in his mind. A top student at Harvard, proficient in several languages, knows her way around a wrench. James knew Krista was an exceptional, polished professional, but he never knew just how multi-talented she was. And although he had only been joking that night in the restaurant, he couldn't deny that Krista was now without her old job because of him. He couldn't just leave her standing at the dock. James sighed. He reached out to Krista to help her with her bag. "Welcome aboard," he said. Krista was relieved. She knew James was a kind person who wouldn't abandon her there on the dock, but still, it was a close call. She completely disregarded the feelings of the other 2 ladies in this little saga. Her crafty mind was already thinking up ways to deal with them later. They hadn't even left New York Harbor yet, and James was mentally exhausted. He no longer cared how Vanessa or Katie felt about bringing Krista aboard. By this point, he was immune to their murderous gazes. As long as they didn't cut him up for chum and throw him into the sea to feed the fish, he'd worry about them later. Right now, he had a yacht to launch. One thing did nag at him, though. Vanessa and Katie no longer seemed to be quarreling. It was as if they'd forged some silent alliance against him. Vanessa even seemed to have accepted Krista's presence on the trip, which was really strange. As James went through the pre-departure checklist, his 3 passengers were busy setting up their rooms. Although they clearly hadn't become close friends all of a sudden, at least there were no fights. That was good enough for James. A tolerable coexistence was all he could hope for at the moment. As he ticked off items on the checklist, James's mood began to improve. Instead of paying attention to what his passengers were thinking, he gave his beautiful yacht all his attention. At a little after 10 in the morning, James pushed the starter button on the console. The engines cranked up with a dull rumble. The journey to the Maldives had officially begun. With a steady hand, he piloted the boat into the vast Atlantic Ocean. The sea was magnificent that day. Sparse white clouds punctuated the deep blue sky. Seagulls squawked and circled above, adding just the right maritime touch. One by one, the ladies came to the deck to enjoy the beautiful view. Despite the drama and anger of the morning, they couldn't help but surrender to the excitement of the trip. The sea, it's so gorgeous. Oh, smell the air. I love it. James, you bastard. Hee hee hee. In no time at all, the 3 women, mimosas in hand, were giggling happily. Their faces were brimming with joy, intoxicated by the magnificent scenery. It was as if all of their hostility had drifted away on the ocean breeze. James could only watch the gaiety from above as he monitored the instrument panel in the cockpit. They looked like best friends. Seeing his 3 gorgeous companions snapping selfies and enjoying the scenery on deck, he decided it was time for him to relax too. It was his yacht after all. Just do it, he thought. After setting the controls on automatic pilot, he joined them on the deck. He greeted them sheepishly. Hi, well, are you having a good time? The ladies didn't even acknowledge his presence. They carried on chatting, drinking, and taking photos for their social media accounts. He tried again. Not bad, huh, Katie? She didn't even look up, scrolling through her phone as if she hadn't heard him. He walked over to Vanessa and smiled gently. Beautiful, isn't it? She acted as if he wasn't there. Strike 2. But Krista wouldn't ignore him, would she? He joined her by the railing. Who knew the Atlantic could be so blue, right? Krista only nodded at him distractedly and turned back to her phone. She was on a video call with her sister. Strike 3. Frustrated, James had no choice but to head back to the cockpit on the upper level. The ladies continued with their merriment below. James shook his head helplessly and muttered, "Damn, turns out I'm just a helmsman here." Episode 69. Just a Small Piece. James sat at the helm and sulked. All of a sudden, it was 3 against 1, and this was his trip. He studied the charts and determined their current location. Then he roughly calculated their route. If he got it right, they would need at least a month to reach the Republic of Maldives off the southwest tip of India. One concern James had was the monotony of a transatlantic voyage. As long as the weather didn't become treacherous, the journey could become dull after the initial excitement wore off. It might give his passengers time to brew up trouble. But it was too late to worry about that now. They were on their way. What was going to happen was going to happen. James set the controls to autopilot and looked out to sea. To his mild surprise, the voyage across the Atlantic into the Mediterranean and through the Suez Canal was uneventful. It was a leisurely journey, the nautical miles quietly slipping by in a dreamy haze. The final leg began when James piloted the yacht through the Gulf of Oman and into the Indian Ocean. Everything on board performed flawlessly. The movie lounge, the satellite TV, the hot tub and sauna, the fitness equipment. James couldn't have been happier with his purchase. More than once, he reached out to Stephen Leland at East Ocean Maritime to express his pleasure. This was the ultimate playground of the rich. Ordinary people couldn't fathom the extravagant world of life aboard a luxury superyacht. Katie, Vanessa, and Krista were thoroughly enjoying the trip. They immersed themselves in the yacht's many magnificent features, savoring their free time traveling around the world. James, on the other hand, seemed to have been demoted from the captain to the hired help. He became a combination helmsman, equipment manager, and occasional cook, performing the many tasks necessary to run a large vessel at sea. The women bonded over their ample free time. During the day, they sunned themselves on deck, read novels, or lazily followed their social media feeds, enjoyed leisurely meals, and drank wine, champagne, or cocktails depending upon their mood. At night, they sat together in their private cinema in the passenger cabin, appreciating the latest blockbusters from all over the world. They cooked gourmet meals together, exercised together, and recreated together. Carefree, relaxed, and comfortable, all their worries had been washed away. Meanwhile, after James had tended to his chores, there was nothing for him to do. It became a bit annoying. Another peaceful day at sea. Vanessa, Katie, and Krista were on deck enjoying the stunning Indian Ocean. James emerged from the lower deck. He cast a glance at them and didn't speak. It was kind of the norm around here. With a few fishing rods in hand, he walked straight to the hydraulic platform in the stern. He wanted to fish. The fishing tackle caught the ladies' attention. They hadn't fished since they were off the Azores. It would be something new to do. But they still pretended to sunbathe, showing no interest in James. From time to time, they'd peek over at him, but that was the extent of their participation. James chuckled inwardly. He knew they were watching him and had become a touch bored with the routine of life at sea, even a luxurious one like they'd been living. He was in no hurry. He took his time preparing the reel and setting the hook on one of the rods. He cast the line into the sea, then prepared and cast the second line. Then he stretched out on the platform and basked in the sun. He didn't need to stare at the two rigs. When he got a hit, the line would unreel noisily. He had already studied the charts. They happened to be in a location where cold and warm currents met in the Indian Ocean. There were all sorts of sea life here: grouper, snapper, tuna, even Indian salmon, actually the four-finger threadfin. If all went well, he would soon catch a fish. The plan was to barbecue it out on the open deck and lure his passengers over to him. The reel on the smaller rod began spinning wildly as the line went taut and the rod bent toward the water. He had one. James jumped up, set the hook, and began reeling. He could feel the weight of the catch as he pulled back on the rod. The fellow hiding under the water was not small. After a 10-minute struggle, a fat body appeared on the surface of the water. It was a grouper, almost 4 feet long. The ladies could not sit still anymore. They watched the battle and offered running commentary as James reeled it in. Holy cow, it's a big guy. What is it? Do you know what kind of fish it is? All I want to know is, can we eat it? James grinned. He was enjoying the rare spurt of camaraderie. With the grouper safely landed on deck, he went back to the galley and took out a fillet knife, a jug of fresh water, and spices. He made quick work of washing, gutting, and filleting the fish. Then he placed it on the preheated grill and started roasting it. Like everything on the yacht, the grill was ultra high-end, an Encore by American Made, handcrafted in California and costing more than $12,000. It was easy to control and always cooked food to perfection. Although James' barbecue skills were not as good as his father's, in a short while he had the fat grouper sizzling and dripping with oil. The fragrance of the barbecued fish drifted onto the deck. He could see the ladies fidgeting in their chairs, their willpower slowly eroding as the delicious aroma reached their noses. James just bided his time. Once the fish was cooked through and the internal temperature had reached 145 degrees, he lifted the fillets off the grill and plopped them on a platter. Then he sliced a lemon into wedges and ladled special Indian hot sauce into a small bowl. James tore off a piece of cooked meat with his hand and slowly put it into his mouth. He closed his eyes and savored the taste. He moaned. This is amazing. The women ignored him, but they were salivating, their defenses crumbling. So juicy. Wow, delicious. One more piece. The first to fold was Vanessa. She walked over and looked at James with a coy smile. Just a small piece, was all she said. After the cold shoulder she'd given him over these past few weeks, he couldn't resist doling out a little revenge. Sorry, no, he said daintily. He put another piece of golden meat into his mouth, chewed slowly and swallowed, then wiped the oil from his lips with a linen napkin. Vanessa knew exactly what James was doing, so she couldn't get angry. She'd earned the payback. What's the big deal? Katie suddenly called out. I'll catch fish for us later. Vanessa headed back to the others. She couldn't risk breaking up their alliance by kowtowing to James over a taste of food. She had taken only a few steps when James called out. I changed my mind. If you wouldn't mind going to the galley and fetching me a can of Red Stripe, I'll share my fish with you. Screw the sisterhood crap, Vanessa thought. She went straight to the galley and came back with the cold beer, plus one for herself. She and James filled their plates and sat down to eat. That was enough for Krista and Katie. They each grabbed a plate and joined in the barbecue. James was magnanimous about the whole thing. He just quietly accepted them with a smile. Everyone ate with relish. They dipped chunks of grilled fish in the hot sauce and washed it down with beer or chilled white wine. Soon, the boat was filled with relaxed conversation and laughter. James was pleased by this apparent detente. The three ladies seemed to have dropped their pact against him, at least for now. Episode 70. James feeds the fish. James, you know your way around a barbecue. Katie disregarded ordinary table manners like everyone else at the table and put a piece of grilled fish into her mouth with her hands. Krista agreed, speaking with a mouthful of food. Yeah, this is delicious. Who figured you knew how to grill so well? This is nothing, Vanessa chimed in. James has a lot of hidden talents. She beamed at him sitting next to her. She thought back to their trip to his hometown and how his parents had fussed over her. It gave her insight into James the others didn't have, she felt. The comment, therefore, came across as possessive and a little catty. Despite the united front they'd held against James, the truth was the atmosphere on the yacht was a bit fragile. Katie also thought she was the closest with James after the fun class reunion and their harrowing experience in Hoboken. And Krista was playing the long game, maneuvering to win his affections in the end. The atmosphere at the table chilled. Vanessa had disregarded their feelings and openly flirted with James. How could she pretend they wouldn't mind? It was a bit easier for Krista to conceal her emotions. Yes, she had feelings for James, but the others didn't know that. To them, she had come on this trip as his assistant, and nothing more. Katie was another matter. She and James had a crush on each other when they were in college. After he'd saved her from Lee Taylor and the Mafia thugs, she'd expressed her strong feelings for him. More importantly, he had reciprocated and invited her on this trip. In her eyes, then, James was her boyfriend already, and seeing her boyfriend sharing an intimate history with another woman bugged the heck out of her. James sensed the tension and tried to lighten the mood. You guys are exaggerating. I'm not that good. I got lucky with the grilling. No big deal. Vanessa was not convinced by his modesty. Why are you selling yourself short? She said. If I say you have skills, then you have skills. She didn't even look at Katie's fierce gaze. Instead, she leaned over and wrapped her arms around James's waist. Katie's eyes blazed. Vanessa was openly staking her claims to James, and she wasn't having any of it. How dare you hug my boyfriend in front of me, she shouted. Although Krista didn't allow her hostility to show on the surface, she was not happy about the physical display of affection either, but her icy silence revealed her displeasure. Seeing the situation deteriorating rapidly, James wanted to yank Vanessa's hands away, but he couldn't. She was hugging him too tightly. Well, actually, he could have easily removed her hands, but he did not want to seem rude to her. He felt trapped. He could only sit passively as this hideous scene unfolded, an unwilling bystander and participant in it. Katie wanted to explode with anger, but she was no dummy. She knew she had to get her emotions under control. If she let her anger get the best of her, it would only backfire, making her look petty in his eyes. It was a critical moment. She gave James a bright smile and said sweetly, "What other skills do you have, James? Show us." Vanessa let go of him and joined in. "Yes, James, show us." That's when Katie made her move. Now that he was disentangled from Vanessa, she leaned over and gave him a kiss. James felt a chill down his spine. Now 2 beautiful women had laid hands on him. This could get ugly fast. Just as he was feeling the beginning of a raging headache, Krista suddenly got up, walked around the table, and placed her hands on his shoulders. She started rubbing them gently. "Sir, let me massage your shoulders. They must be sore from hauling in that huge fish." To be honest, Krista's massage technique was very professional, soothing him in waves of comfort. If it were any other day, he would have surrendered himself to the sensual pleasure. But he couldn't. His heart was trembling. 2 gorgeous suitors were already enough to give him a headache. Now with Krista in the mix, his troubles had increased 100-fold. She leaned over and whispered in his ear, "How are you feeling, sir? Are you comfortable?" Her warm breath against his ear woke up the passion that was trying its best to remain tamped down deep inside his body. All kinds of wild fantasies flashed through his mind. He was a man, after all. It was normal for him to have a libido. Besides, these ladies were literally throwing themselves at him. Just as quickly, he snapped out of it. He was delusional if he thought he could somehow juggle these 3 formidable women. If he didn't handle the moment just so, he would end up at the bottom of the Indian Ocean feeding the fishes. James reacted swiftly. The moment Krista asked her question, he stood up. He had made up his mind. He had to escape. Since he did not want to offend them, he would just avoid them. Perhaps if he made himself scarce, they would resolve this matter among themselves. By the time they reached the Maldives, he can have fun again. James, however, had sprung up a little too abruptly. At that moment, Katie was leaning in close, probably to drag him away from Krista, and he knocked into her. She fell heavily to the ground. This was becoming a disaster, and all because he had invited them together on the shot with ill-conceived fantasies in his head. "Katie, are you okay?" he said with a note of alarm in his voice. Katie picked herself up off the deck. "I'm fine, but thanks for your concern," she said sweetly. She looked at Vanessa and Krista with a triumphant glint in her eyes. "Ouch, my leg!" Vanessa had been sitting quietly, steaming about this circus she was being forced to watch. She immediately cried out in pain to attract James's attention. "I've been sitting for too long. I'm getting a cramp in my leg. Come and help me up, James." As he jumped up to do what he was told, Krista covered her head with her hands, a look of pain twisting her face. "Ooh, my stomach hurts, James. Come over and help me rub it." James was speechless. He had assumed that the issue had been resolved after so many pleasant days on the yacht. The ladies had been getting along so well. But now it seemed as if the truce was over and war had been declared. He couldn't see a happy ending to the conflict. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, James caught a shadow passing by under the water near the hull. He was shocked at first, then delighted. He hurried to the edge of the deck and leaned over the railing. Concerned by his disturbing action, they immediately dropped their act and called out to him. "James, where are you going? What are you up to? Sir, what are you doing?" James turned around and looked at them with a grin. "I know what you ladies are thinking," he said. "You were going to throw me into the sea to feed the fish, right? Well, I'll save you the trouble. Since I'm going to end up in a fish's stomach anyway, I might as well do the honors myself." Then he stood on the top rail and jumped into the Indian Ocean. Episode 71, A Huge Harvest. James disappeared under the water. James, don't. No. Sir, don't do it. Vanessa, Katie, and Krista yelled almost at the same time, but it was too late. The three of them realized what he was up to and all had reached out to grab him, but they caught only air. They stared into the water. There was no sign of him. All they could see were the unending waves of the Indian Ocean. The ladies stood together on the hydraulic platform and called out some more. Nothing. He didn't surface. They were incredibly worried that they may have forced James into making such an impulsive and extreme decision. Almost a minute had passed and he had yet to surface. Vanessa pointed at Katie and Krista and scolded them fiercely. It's your fault. It's all your fault. Hurry up and return my James to me. Katie refused to accept blame for anything. Bawling her eyes out, she shot back. You have the nerve to say that to me? If you hadn't thrown yourself at him, this wouldn't have happened. If James dies, it will be all your fault. This set off a furious back and forth between the women. It's your fault. It's all your fault. No, it's your fault. It's your fault. It's your fault. It's your fault. Krista, having remained silent the whole time, suddenly shouted at the top of her lungs. Enough! Shut up, both of you. While you idiots are arguing, James is still in the water. Are you planning to fish his corpse out later? Despite her confident personality honed by years of dealing with wealthy executives, Krista had been relatively low-key ever since boarding the yacht. That's why her sudden outburst took Vanessa and Katie by surprise. It was as if a couple of bickering children had been hushed by their teacher. Besides, what she said made sense. They shouldn't waste time fighting. The most important thing now was to save James. Once the two of them were silent, Krista quickly asked, "Which one of you can swim?" Vanessa raised her hand like an obedient student. "I can." Katie shook her head anxiously. "I can barely dog paddle. I'm not going into the sea." "All right," Krista said in a commanding tone. "Vanessa, you come with me into the water. Katie, go get 3 life jackets and throw them to us. Then go below deck and launch the speedboat." Even in such a critical situation, Krista was able to maintain her composure. It was extraordinary. Her mind functioned like a machine. She was methodical and decisive. She stripped off her clothes to reveal a bikini underneath. Vanessa did the same, then waited for Krista's next instructions. Katie rushed off to get the life jackets. They were so preoccupied preparing their impromptu search and rescue operation, they didn't notice the line of the second fishing rod shaking violently. Just as Krista and Vanessa were about to jump overboard, a bubbling disturbance appeared on the surface of the sea right next to the yacht. After the water settled, there was James, calmly treading water. He reached up with a hand to wipe the seawater from his face. When he saw Vanessa and Krista in their skimpy swimsuits at the edge of the yacht's platform, he was stunned. Under the bright sunlight, he could fully appreciate their hot bodies. He couldn't help but grin. "Ladies, did you put on those bikinis just for me?" Vanessa could have fainted with relief. "James," she shouted, "you almost scared me to death." Krista looked on with a cold expression. She seemed more like an annoyed older sister than his personal assistant. "Sir, if this was your idea of a joke, it was not funny at all," she said. When she saw James bobbing in the water, Katie's anxiety disappeared in an instant. She was so overwhelmed with happiness to see him alive, she didn't even take notice of his comment about the other women's bodies. Seeing Katie standing there in a daze, Krista snapped at her. "What are you standing there for? Throw him a life jacket. We'll pull him up together." Katie quickly came to her senses. She plucked off one of the life preservers draped over her arm and threw it into the sea. James continued to tread water. "Don't you worry about me," he said. "I'm not going to drown anytime soon. Krista, Vanessa, one of you grab the rod and start reeling. We're going to have another big harvest." The two ladies stood frozen in place, confused. Had they misunderstood James's behavior? Did he jump into the ocean not to commit suicide, but for some other reason? James broke them out of their musing. "Don't just stand there. Grab the rod. If you waste more time, this one is going to get away." He turned his attention to Katie. "Forget the life jackets. Go to the storage room and get me a harpoon and a net. Hurry!" The three women jumped into action. Krista grabbed the second rod and began reeling and pulling. Vanessa braced her from behind so she wouldn't slip on the wet deck. Katie ran to the storage room to fetch the harpoon and net as instructed. With Vanessa's help, Krista worked the line like a professional angler. Several hard-fought minutes later, she hauled a 6-foot fish from the deep sea. Vanessa had sharp eyes. She cried out in surprise. A bluefin tuna! Even Krista, who had been calm and determined until this point, opened her mouth wide. "God, a bluefin," she said. Although she'd never seen one with her own eyes, she understood how precious this fish was. She'd seen bluefin tunas on sport fishing shows, and the host always talked about their rarity. Prized for its delicious meat, in the right market, a quality specimen could go for as much as $200 a pound. James swam over to the hooked fish and gently patted its head. "Not bad, huh?" he said with a huge grin. Vanessa hung her head over the water to get a closer look. "James, you are awesome," she said. Krista smiled slightly. She could not hide the excitement in her eyes. However, just as Vanessa grabbed the line to bring the catch on deck, the big tuna suddenly swung its tail and smashed it into James's shoulder with considerable force. The fish seemed to have found a second wind and rocketed out into the open water. On the hydraulic platform, the fishing reel started to spin wildly. Krista's reaction was lightning fast. In an instant, she grabbed the rod and pulled back, but the bluefin's strength was too great. She was almost pulled into the sea. "Vanessa," James shouted, "help Krista." When she heard his thundering voice, Vanessa also sprang into action. She grabbed the rod as well, and together she and Krista pulled back with all their might. It was an epic contest of strength between the giant tuna and the two determined women. Episode 72. You'll catch a cold. James watched the two beauties pulling back on the fishing line and smiled. In fact, he had no plans to commit suicide despite his joking earlier about feeding the fishes. Instead, he had seen a big shadow flash under the surface. Then he saw the second fishing line go taut. In order to find out what was taking the bait, he jumped into the water. He never expected it would cause the women to seriously think they'd forced him to commit suicide. However, there was a silver lining to all of this. Something that he had racked his mind to solve was now resolved on its own. The ladies' concern for him was genuine. More to the point, they'd set aside their differences to rescue him. Hence, when he returned to the yacht, he would no longer have to face that dilemma, or at least that's what he hoped. Vanessa and Krista forcefully pulled on the rod. Their delicate arms were tight with strain, battling the enormous force of the escaping fish. As their arms were squeezed in front of their chests, James couldn't help notice that their breasts became even more prominent. Since he had nothing else to do, he leisurely enjoyed the scenery. It would have been better if he did not look. He felt his blood vessels swelling and his body heating up. "I can't take it anymore. They are just too sexy," he muttered. He tried to think of something else, baseball statistics, sharks, anything to distract himself. Under Krista and Vanessa's joint effort, the bluefin tuna that had tried so valiantly to escape back to the depths finally gave up the struggle. It remained stationary next to the boat, exhausted. By this time, Katie had returned from the storage room with the harpoon and net, as well as a portable ladder. James was impressed with her consideration. The ladder would make it easier for him to get back up onto the yacht, but he had more to do first. "Quick, Katie, throw me the net," he shouted. She tossed it immediately and it plopped in the water right next to him. With net in hand, James swam over to the tuna. Once Krista and Vanessa had pulled it partially out of the water, he wrapped the net around the fish, leaving it no way out this time. The tuna suddenly surged back to life. It churned violently in the net, trying to escape once more. The commotion briefly forced James back, but this time he was ready. He firmly grabbed the net and gave it a strong tug. The muscles on his arms swelled rapidly. The women could clearly see his huge biceps under his long-sleeve shirt. The tuna, which easily weighed several hundred pounds, flew out of the water. then smashed heavily onto the surface with a tremendous splash only a few feet from the yacht. However, the miserable fate of the poor fish was not over yet. It had just begun. James yanked the huge tuna up out of the water again, then smashed it back down. He did it again, and again. It was too much for the fish. Finally, it gave up the fight for good. Seeing James's fierceness and his body full of adrenaline, the ladies were wide-eyed and tongue-tied. He looked so unbelievably manly. All animals are born with an inherent instinct to seek a strong partner. They rely on their mates for protection and survival in difficult times. The power James displayed in that moment was exactly like that. The women were enraptured by his performance. They could practically smell the hormones emanating from his body. James was oblivious to their attention. He yelled up to Katie, "Set the ladder and go help Krista and Vanessa." She nodded blankly and quickly fixed the ladder to the brackets in the platform before going to help pull the tuna aboard. James swam to the back of the yacht and grabbed the ladder with one hand. He climbed up while holding the net in the other hand. The four of them worked together and finally managed to get their extremely precious bluefin tuna out of the water and under control. After the adrenaline finally wore off, James fell limply to the deck. He was bone tired. All three women sat down right on the deck next to him. They were exhausted as well. They didn't have a scale, but they estimated the fish weighed close to 500 pounds. Its body was like a fat swimming pig that had been pampered for years. It was a miracle they'd managed to drag it aboard. Despite their profound fatigue, they were all overjoyed with this wonderful harvest. Bluefin tuna was a delicacy served in the fanciest restaurants in the world. As James lay sprawled on the deck, Vanessa flipped over and rolled to his side. She draped one of her slim legs over his body and moved her soft lips close to his ear. "You were spectacular just now," she cooed seductively. James felt his entire body go numb. It felt like an electric current had jolted him from head to toe. He could see virtually every inch of her creamy tan skin beneath her revealing bikini. Hormones flooded into his bloodstream. The beast within was raring to go on a rampage. He did not dare look into Vanessa's eyes. He was worried he would completely lose control and pin her down right there on the deck in front of all of God's creation, not to mention Katie and Krista. Right then, the system notification rang out in James's mind. "You have captured a rare species of fish and triggered a special reward. You have obtained a chance to draw the lottery for a special skill. Would you like to draw immediately?" Saved by the bell, as they say. James was grateful for the distraction. Anything could trigger a special reward, it seemed, even catching a fish. This was awesome. However, this was clearly not the time to draw the reward. Vanessa had plastered herself against him, her voluptuous chest pressing against his wet torso. "Well, James," she continued, "shouldn't we go to the passenger cabin and get you out of your wet clothes?" Just when he thought he could no longer resist Vanessa's advances, Katie interjected. "She's right. We'll be reaching the Maldives soon. If you catch a cold, it will ruin your vacation." Krista echoed Katie's concern with one of her own. "Can't have our captain in the sickbay, you know. Who would pilot the boat?" James knew that their worry wasn't truly about him. They just didn't want Vanessa to sink her claws into him. But he still took it as an opportunity to escape. "Yeah, you guys are right. I should go and change." He threw in a couple of fake sneezes for good measure, then gently peeled Vanessa off of him. Without another word, he scurried down to the passenger cabin and hid in his room.